In December 2009, Susan Powell vanished from her Utah home without a trace. What began as a simple missing person case soon uncovered something far darker: a husband's obsession, a father's twisted desires, and a family destroyed by secrets no one saw coming. This is The Vanishing of Susan Powell, a story of love, control, and unspeakable evil hidden behind suburban walls. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. I want to ask, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Now let's begin the story. In the quiet suburban streets of West Valley City, Utah, the winter of 2009 began like any other. Families decorated their homes with Christmas lights. Children played in the snow, and life moved forward with predictable routine. But on the morning of December 7th, 2009, something happened that would shatter one family forever and create a mystery so dark, so twisted, that it would haunt investigators for years to come. This is the story of Susan Powell, a young mother of two who vanished without a trace, and the horrifying truth that slowly emerged about the man she called her husband. Susan Cox Powell was 28 years old, a devoted mother to her two young sons, Charlie, age 4, and Braden, age 2. She was known by friends and family as sweet, caring, and deeply religious. She had a beautiful smile and an infectious laugh. She worked as a financial analyst and seemed to have built a good life. But behind closed doors, Susan's marriage to her husband, Josh Powell, was crumbling. According to her personal journals, which would later be discovered, Susan had been living in fear. She wrote extensively about Josh's controlling behavior, his volatile temper, and his increasingly bizarre obsession with her. But the most disturbing entries in her journal weren't about Josh alone. They were about Josh's father, Stephen Powell, a man whose presence in their lives had become suffocating and sinister. Stephen Powell was not a typical father-in-law. He was a man with dark, twisted obsessions. He had moved into Josh and Susan's home, and according to Susan's writings, he had developed an inappropriate and frightening fixation on her. She described how Stephen would stare at her constantly, how he would record her without permission, and how he made sexually suggestive comments that made her skin crawl. Investigators would later discover that Stephen had thousands of images of Susan on his computer. Photos taken secretly, some zoomed in on intimate parts of her body. He had journals filled with sexual fantasies about her. This was not just a man who made his daughter-in-law uncomfortable. This was a predator living under the same roof as his victim. Susan had confided in close friends about the situation. She told them that Stephen had even sung songs to her, original compositions that were disturbingly romantic and sexual in nature. He would perform them in front of Josh, who seemed either oblivious or simply didn't care. Susan felt trapped. She had no privacy in her own home. She couldn't shower, couldn't change clothes, couldn't have a moment to herself without feeling Stephen's eyes on her. She documented everything in her journal, and in one particularly chilling entry dated several months before her disappearance, Susan wrote, "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one. Take care of my boys." The financial situation in the Powell household was dire. Josh had recently lost his job, though he hadn't told Susan right away. He would leave the house each morning pretending to go to work, but instead, he was spending hours at the library, using the internet, or sitting in his car. The family was drowning in debt. Their house was in foreclosure. Susan was the sole breadwinner, and the stress was overwhelming. She had begun making plans to leave Josh, to take her boys and start over. She had contacted a divorce attorney and was preparing to file papers after the holidays. She wanted to give her sons one last normal Christmas before everything changed. But she would never get that chance. On the night of December 6th, 2009, Susan put her sons to bed, just like she did every night. She had just returned from church, and neighbors reported seeing the lights on in the Powell home around 8 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of Susan Powell alive. The next morning, Josh Powell called his family from the road. He said he had taken the boys on a spontaneous camping trip in the middle of the night, in freezing temperatures, in a blizzard. He claimed Susan had been at home when they left and that he assumed she had gone to work. But when Susan's coworkers called the police to report she hadn't shown up, officers went to the Powell home. What they found was chilling. The house was locked from the outside. Inside, 2 industrial fans were running in the living room, pointed at a wet spot on the couch. The spot smelled strongly of cleaning chemicals. In the kitchen, police found Susan's purse, her wallet, her phone, and her identification. No woman leaves for work without those items. In the garage, they discovered something even more disturbing. The handle of a snow shovel was wet, and there was a small spot of blood. Josh Powell's story was falling apart, and fast. When police questioned him about the so-called camping trip, his story made no sense. He claimed he took his 2 toddlers camping at 12:30 a.m. in sub-zero temperatures during a snowstorm. He said he thought it was Sunday, not Monday, and that's why he didn't realize Susan would have work. But his sons, when gently interviewed, told a very different story. Little Charlie said that Mommy had gone camping with them. He said Mommy was in the trunk of the car. The police immediately named Josh Powell as a person of interest, though they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. They began building their case methodically. They searched the Powell home from top to bottom. They found disturbing evidence of Josh's state of mind in the weeks before Susan disappeared. His computer search history revealed queries about natural disasters, how to hide bodies, abandoned mines in Utah, and the Simpson Springs area, a remote desert location about 75 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. They also found evidence that Josh had been selling Susan's belongings on Craigslist, including her wedding ring, while she was still missing. When confronted, Josh claimed Susan had given him permission to sell her things. It was a lie that no one believed. The camping site Josh claimed to have visited was examined by investigators. It was in the freezing wilderness of the Simpson Springs area. The story made no sense. Why would anyone take 2 toddlers camping in sub-zero temperatures in the middle of the night? Josh said he wanted to roast marshmallows and look at the stars. But the night in question had been overcast with heavy snow. There were no stars to see. When police processed Josh's vehicle, they found disturbing evidence. There was a large tarp in the back with Susan's blood on it. There were also traces of accelerant, suggesting Josh had attempted to destroy evidence by burning something. Most damning of all, cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of human decomposition in the cargo area of the vehicle. For years, Josh Powell maintained his innocence. He moved back to Washington State to live with his father, Stephen. He hired lawyers, did media interviews, and played the role of the grieving, confused husband. But investigators were building a case. They discovered that Josh had taken out a significant life insurance policy on Susan just months before her disappearance. They found evidence that he had withdrawn money, stopped going to work, and had researched how to hide bodies. His computer search history was damning, with queries about deserts, abandoned mine shafts, and decomposition. Then, in a shocking turn, Stephen Powell was arrested, not for Susan's disappearance, but for voyeurism and possession of child pornography. When police raided his home, they found the sickening evidence of his obsession with Susan and with young girls in the neighborhood. He was sentenced to prison, and Josh lost custody of his sons. The discovery of Stephen Powell's depravity opened a window into the Powell family that was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Stephen had been secretly recording Susan for years. He had installed hidden cameras in the bathroom. He had taken photographs of her through windows. He had compiled thousands of images, which he stored on multiple hard drives and USB drives hidden throughout his home. But it wasn't just Susan. Stephen had also been photographing neighbor girls, some as young as 8 years old, through their windows as they changed clothes or bathed. He had videos of them playing in their yards, zoomed in on their bodies. The man was a predator of the worst kind, and he had been living in the same house as Susan and her children for months. During the investigation of Stephen's home, police also found evidence that Josh had been there on December 6th and 7th, despite initially claiming he had been camping. Cell phone records showed his phone pinging off towers near his father's house in Washington, over 800 miles away, on December 7th. This was a critical piece of evidence. It meant Josh had lied about his timeline. It meant he had driven through the night, possibly with Susan's body, to dispose of evidence. Investigators began searching mining areas between Utah and Washington, focusing on abandoned mine shafts that matched Josh's internet searches. They found nothing. Susan's body remained missing. The boys, Charlie and Braden, were placed in the care of Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. The Coxes were devastated by their daughter's disappearance, but they threw themselves into caring for their grandsons. The boys were traumatized. They had nightmares. They would ask where Mommy was. And slowly, in the safety of their grandparents' home, they began to reveal pieces of what had happened that night. Charlie told his grandparents that Mommy and Daddy had a big fight. He said Daddy hurt Mommy. He said they went on a trip and Mommy was in the trunk and she didn't wake up. These statements were heartbreaking, but they weren't enough for prosecutors to charge Josh Powell with murder. They needed a body. They needed more evidence, and Josh knew it. Social workers arranged supervised visits for Josh to see his sons, hoping that one day he might tell the truth about what happened to their mother. But Josh Powell had other plans. In the months leading up to February 2012, Josh's behavior became increasingly erratic. He sold his possessions. He sent goodbye emails to family members. He wrote letters to his pastor. He was preparing for something, and the people around him were growing concerned. On February 5th, 2012, a social worker named Elizabeth Griffin Hall brought Charlie and Braden to Josh's rental home for a scheduled visit. The moment the boys ran up to the door, excited to see their father, Josh let them inside and then slammed the door in Elizabeth's face, locking it. She immediately smelled gasoline. She pounded on the door, shouting for Josh to open it. He didn't respond. She ran back to her car and called 911. The 911 call is one of the most harrowing pieces of audio ever recorded. Elizabeth is frantic, screaming that something is wrong, that she can smell gasoline, that Josh has locked her out with the children inside. The dispatcher doesn't seem to understand the urgency. Elizabeth shouts, "He won't let me in the door. I'm afraid for the kids. He took them from me and locked me out." The dispatcher calmly asks for the address, asks what the emergency is, treats it like a routine custody dispute. Elizabeth screams, "I need help now. This is an emergency. The kids are in danger." Still, the dispatcher doesn't send units with urgency. Precious minutes tick by. And then, in an explosion that could be heard for blocks, Josh Powell set his house on fire with himself and his two sons inside. Charlie and Braden Powell, ages 7 and 5, died of smoke inhalation and burns. Investigators later determined that Josh had attacked both boys with a hatchet before igniting the gasoline he had poured throughout the house. The boys suffered blunt force trauma to their heads and necks. They were injured, bleeding, and terrified when the fire started. Josh died from a self-inflicted hatchet wound to the head before the fire consumed him. It was a murder-suicide of unimaginable cruelty, a final act of control and rage from a man who had lost everything. In the ruins of the home, investigators found explicit photos Josh had taken of his sons, evidence of sexual abuse. They also found journals, letters, and emails that confirmed what everyone had feared. Josh Powell had murdered Susan. He had killed her that December night, likely in their home, and disposed of her body in one of the abandoned mine shafts he had researched in the remote Utah desert. The aftermath of the tragedy was devastating. The 911 dispatcher, who failed to respond appropriately, was later fired after an internal investigation. Elizabeth Griffin Hall, the social worker who had tried desperately to save those boys, was traumatized. She filed a lawsuit against the state, arguing that she had been put in an impossible situation and that warning signs about Josh's mental state had been ignored. Chuck and Judy Cox, who had lost their daughter and now their grandsons, became advocates for domestic violence victims and for reforming the family court system that they believed had failed to protect their grandsons. To this day, Susan Powell's body has never been found. Her family holds out hope that one day, someone will discover her remains and bring her home. The case remains open, but the truth is clear. Susan Powell was murdered by her husband, a man consumed by control, obsession, and rage, enabled by a father whose own depravity knew no bounds. This story is not just about a woman who vanished. It's about the insidious nature of domestic abuse, the warning signs that are ignored, and the unimaginable evil that can lurk behind the facade of a normal suburban family. Susan Powell wrote in her journal that if anything happened to her, it would not be an accident. She knew. And tragically, she was right.
The doorbell that only rang at 3:15 a.m. The house on Sycamore Street, in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, was a perfect blend of modern comfort and classic charm. Its white picket fence, a meticulously manicured lawn, and a sleek gray exterior were a welcome sight for Julia, a successful software engineer. She had just bought the house, a single story with a sunroom that overlooked the mountains, and it was everything she had worked for. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the house, with its smart locks and automated lighting, felt like an extension of her own organized life. The first few weeks were idyllic. She spent her evenings in the sunroom, watching the sunset, her days filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life well earned. The house was calm, a haven of peace, until the night the doorbell rang. It was 3:15 a.m. Julia was a light sleeper, and the sound of the chime, a classic ding-dong that echoed through the silent house, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Who would be at her door at this hour? She crept out of bed, her phone in her hand, and checked the security camera feed. Her porch was empty. No one. The motion sensor hadn't been triggered, and the camera log showed no activity. It was a phantom chime. She went to the front door, peered through the peephole, and saw only the dark, empty street. She went back to bed, her mind racing, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The next night, it happened again. 3:15 a.m. The same ding-dong. She sprang out of bed, checked the camera, and found nothing. This time, a cold dread replaced her initial surprise. This was not a fluke, it was a pattern. She started to dread the night, the clock ticking closer and closer to the appointed hour. She would sit up in bed, her eyes fixed on the digital display, waiting for the sound that was both impossible and terrifyingly real. She tried everything to stop it. She disabled the smart doorbell, unplugged the chime, and even went as far as to remove the button itself from the wall. The house was silent, dark, and empty. She went to bed, a profound sense of relief washing over her. She would finally get some rest. But at 3:15 a.m., the sound came again. It was faint this time, a ghostly echo of the chime, as if the sound itself had been imprinted on the house. It was not a physical sound. It was an auditory hallucination, a sound that was only for her. She began to spiral. The lack of sleep, combined with the psychological terror of the phantom chime, was taking its toll. Her work was suffering, her perfectly organized life was falling apart, and her friends started to notice her gaunt face and haunted eyes. She tried to tell them, but her words sounded crazy, even to her own ears. My doorbell keeps ringing, but there's no one there. They suggested she was stressed, that she was imagining it, but she knew she wasn't. The fear was too real. She tried to fight back with logic. She bought a new, more advanced security system. She installed infrared cameras and motion sensors all around the perimeter of her house. She even set up a camera inside the house, pointing at the front door, hoping to catch some glimpse of the impossible. She went to bed that night, a single, determined thought in her mind. She would find an answer. At 3:15 a.m., the faint, ghostly ding-dong echoed through her room. She sprang out of bed, grabbed her tablet, and checked the security camera feed. The outside cameras were still, the street was empty, and the motion sensors showed no activity. She switched to the inside camera, and her blood ran cold. The camera showed her front door, perfectly still and unremarkable. But as she watched, she saw a faint indentation appear on the surface of the wood, a small, circular impression, as if an invisible finger were pressing the now absent doorbell button. It was a phantom touch, a contact that was only visible to the camera's eye. The indentation lingered for a moment and then faded. The phantom chime had been the sound of an invisible visitor, an impossible presence that was trying to get into her house. Julia's mind reeled. This was not a hallucination. This was real. She was being haunted. But why? What did it want? She went back to the footage, pausing it, zooming in on the circular indentation. It was a perfect circle, a small, silent ring of pressure on her door. It was a persistent, patient, and terrifying attempt to get her attention. She had lived in this house for weeks, and this thing had been there all along, waiting for the opportune moment, for the dead of night, to announce its presence. She couldn't stay. She put the house on the market, desperate to escape the phantom chime and the invisible visitor. She packed her belongings with a frantic energy, throwing things into boxes without care. She just needed to be out. She needed to be gone before the next night. The house sold quickly, and she moved into a high-rise apartment in the city, a place with a doorman and security cameras on every floor. She felt a profound sense of relief as she settled in. The city noise was a comforting blanket, a constant, predictable sound that kept the silence at bay. She slept soundly for a week, and then two. She started to believe she had escaped. But some things can't be escaped. Sometimes a haunting is not about a place, it's about a person. One night, she was having a restless dream. A dream of a long, dark hallway and a ringing sound in the distance. She woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding. The clock on her nightstand read 3:15 a.m. A profound, icy coldness filled her room, seeping into her skin. She heard a sound, a faint, impossible ding-dong. It was not coming from her doorbell. It was coming from inside her phone. A ghostly echo, a notification sound she had never heard before. She looked at her phone. There was a notification on her calendar. It said, "Time to open the door." Her mind went blank with terror. It had followed her. It had found her. It was not the house. It was her. The doorbell wasn't meant for the house. It was meant for her. It was a silent, persistent knock on her soul, a plea for her to let it in. She looked at the door of her apartment, a solid, modern, locked door. She imagined the circular indentation on the surface of the wood, the invisible finger pressing against it, patiently waiting for her to respond. She knew she couldn't run anymore. This wasn't a problem she could solve with technology or logic. This was something ancient, something that had found her for reasons she couldn't fathom. She had to face it. That night, she made a decision. She would open the door. She sat in a chair in her living room, her eyes fixed on the clock on her phone. She felt the coldness, the familiar dread. The clock ticked closer to 3:15 a.m. She took a deep breath. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the most logical thing to do was to face the impossible. 3:15 a.m. The sound came. The faint, ghostly ding-dong, a sound that was not in her ears but in her mind. She stood up, her legs shaking, and walked to her front door. She took a deep breath, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she unlocked the deadbolt. She turned the knob and slowly, deliberately, pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. The lights were on, the cameras were on, and there was no one there. She felt a profound sense of confusion. She had expected a gaunt figure, a shadow, a presence. But there was nothing. The doorbell didn't ring again. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the empty hallway. She closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in months. She had faced her fear, and it had vanished. She woke up the next morning, feeling a sense of peace and liberation she had never known. She thought about the phantom chime, about the ghost that had haunted her. It was over. She was free. But some things are not that simple. As she was getting ready for work, she noticed something strange on her left hand. On her ring finger, a small circular impression, a faint, ghostly bruise, as if an invisible ring had been pressed onto her skin. She tried to rub it off, but it wouldn't fade. It was a permanent mark, a silent souvenir of the night she had opened the door. She looked at her hand, and she felt a sudden, deep sense of understanding. It wasn't about a door. It was about a commitment. She had invited it in. She had accepted its presence. The doorbell was not a request to enter. It was a symbol of a promise. She had been chosen. And the phantom chime had been the sound of an unseen ceremony. She was now bound to the thing that had haunted her, a partner in a haunting she had no memory of. And sometimes, when she's alone and the city is quiet, she looks at her hand, at the faint, circular bruise, and she hears it. A soft, gentle knock. A knock that is not a chime, but a promise. A knock that has followed her and will continue to follow her for the rest of her life. She is not just a homeowner anymore. She is a bride to a ghost. And the phantom chime was the sound of her wedding bells. He woke up and realized someone had tucked him in. The small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of downtown Chicago was everything Alex needed. A cozy space, a view of the skyline, and the comforting anonymity of a bustling city. He was a creature of habit, a man who lived a solitary and predictable life. He worked long hours as a data analyst, and his evenings were a quiet rhythm of takeout, a good book, and a sound sleep. His bed was his sanctuary, a place of peace and rest after a long day of numbers and spreadsheets. He was a man who believed in facts, in data, and in the tangible world. The first time it happened, he woke up with a start, a familiar cold chill running through him. He was covered in a way he wasn't before. His comforter, which he always just pulled up to his waist, was now tucked neatly under his chin, the sides folded firmly under the mattress. It was a perfect, deliberate tuck. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the blinds were closed, and there was no one there. He told himself he had done it in his sleep, a weird, subconscious action. He was a single man. There was no other explanation. He was just tired. He pulled the covers off, untucked the corners, and went back to sleep. The next morning, it happened again. The comforter was tucked neatly under his chin, the sides firmly secured. This time, he was more than just confused. He was unsettled. He lived alone. The door was locked, the windows were sealed. He had no pets. He spent the entire day at work in a state of unease, his mind replaying the image of the perfectly tucked blanket. He couldn't shake the feeling of an unseen presence in his bedroom. That night, he decided to do something about it. He bought a motion-activated camera, a small, discreet one, and placed it on his nightstand, pointing directly at his bed. He wanted proof. He wanted to see himself, in the middle of the night, tucking himself in like a child. He went to bed, a cold, hard lump of dread in his stomach. He didn't sleep well. He woke up at every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, convinced he would catch the culprit in the act. But he never saw anything. In the morning, he checked the camera footage. He fast-forwarded through the video, watching his sleeping form, the slow rise and fall of his chest. He watched for hours, his eyes glued to the screen. At 3:17 a.m., the camera's red light flickered on. He was sleeping soundly. The blanket was just over his waist, as he had left it. Then he saw it. A faint shadow, a fleeting ripple of air, seemed to pass over his bed. The comforter, without a single visible hand to guide it, slowly began to move. The sides folded under the mattress, a perfect tuck. The top of the comforter was pulled up, just to his chin. The motion was slow, deliberate, and silent. There was no one there. Just a shadow, a presence, a force that was tucking him in. Alex's breath hitched in his throat. He went back to the footage, watched it again and again, hoping it was a glitch, a trick of the light, but it wasn't. The motion was too fluid, too purposeful. It was an entity, a thing that was entering his room, not to scare him, not to harm him, but to perform a quiet domestic act. It was tucking him in. The terror of a monster was replaced by a more insidious, a more profound kind of fear. The fear of something that was a part of his life. A silent, unseen companion that watched him sleep and cared for him in its own chilling way. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. The feeling of being watched was too much to bear. He didn't tell his friends or family why he was moving. How could he explain that he was leaving his home because a ghost was tucking him in? He found a new place, a modern building with a doorman, a place where he was sure no one could get in. He meticulously checked every lock, every evening before he went to bed. He was determined to leave the terror behind. The first few nights were peaceful. He slept soundly, his dreams free of shadows and fear. He started to believe it was over, that he had finally escaped whatever had haunted him. But then, one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible circular impression on his pillow, as if a head had been rested there. He dismissed it. A crease in the pillowcase. The next morning, it was there again. And the morning after that, it was a silent message. A new kind of tuck. He began to research the history of his old apartment building. He went to the city archives, poring over old documents and newspaper clippings. He found a story, a small, almost forgotten article from a local newspaper in the 1920s. A woman named Clara had lived in his old apartment. She was an elderly seamstress who lived alone. She was known for her kindness and her love of her small, cozy home. The article mentioned that she had died in her sleep, a peaceful death. The last person to see her had said that she had a strange habit of tucking in her guests even when they were asleep. She believed it was a way of showing care, a quiet, gentle act of love. Alex felt a cold dread so complete it was a physical weight. Clara, the seamstress who had lived in his apartment, she hadn't left. She was still there, in the quiet, empty space, performing her small act of care. She wasn't a monster. She was a ghost who had chosen him, a lonely ghost who was just trying to be a good host. The thought was somehow more terrifying than any demon or ghoul. The ghost of a lonely seamstress who wanted to be his friend. He couldn't go back to the old apartment. He had left her. He had abandoned her. Her simple, kind act of tucking him in. He felt a profound sense of guilt. He had feared her, run from her, when all she had wanted was to care for him. He sat in his new, modern apartment, a city of millions around him, and felt more alone than ever before. He thought of Clara, of the lonely ghost in the old apartment, still waiting, still watching. He decided to go back. He had to. He had to apologize. He had to let her know he wasn't afraid. He went to the old building, a key in his pocket that he had never returned. He went up the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He unlocked the door to his old apartment, and he walked in. The apartment was empty, cold, and quiet. He went to his old bedroom, the place where the tucking had happened. The room was just as he had left it, the bed stripped bare. He went to his old nightstand, the place where he had put the camera. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and he spoke. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered into the empty room. "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." The air grew heavy. The scent of lavender, faint and old, filled the room. He felt a sudden, profound sense of peace. The cold was gone. The fear was gone. He felt a gentle, loving presence. He didn't know if she was there, but he knew she had heard him. He had finally given her the acknowledgement she had so desperately sought. He had apologized. He left the apartment, closing the door behind him, and he didn't look back. He felt a sense of closure, of peace. He had done the right thing. He had faced his fear, and he had found a kind of forgiveness. He was a man who had been haunted, and now he was a man who was free. He went back to his new apartment, to his new life, and for the first time in a very long time, he slept soundly. He was no longer afraid of the dark or of the quiet. He was no longer afraid of being alone. He had faced his greatest fear, and he had found a kind of love in it. But some things are not that simple. The next morning, he woke up with a start. The comforter was tucked neatly under his chin, the sides folded firmly under the mattress. It was a perfect, deliberate tuck. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the blinds were closed, and there was no one there. He looked at the comforter, at the perfect, impossible tuck. The ghost of Clara had followed him. She hadn't wanted to be left behind. She was still with him, in his new apartment, in his new life, a silent, unseen companion. The fear returned, a familiar, cold dread. He had apologized. He had tried to be a good man. But he had been a man who had been chosen, and a ghost who has chosen you will never let you go. The quiet, gentle terror of the tucking would be a part of his life forever. The tucking was a daily occurrence now. It became part of his routine. He would go to bed, leave his covers untucked, and in the morning they would be perfectly folded. It was a constant, unsettling reminder of his unseen companion. He no longer felt fear, but a weary acceptance. It was a part of his life, a strange, impossible roommate. He would find other small signs of her presence. The faint scent of lavender when he walked into his bedroom, a single loose thread on his pillowcase, as if she were a seamstress still at work. He tried to live a normal life, but the secret of his nocturnal visitor was a heavy weight on his soul. He started to talk to her. He would lie in bed in the dark and whisper into the silence. He would tell her about his day, about his work, about the new coffee shop he had found. It was a strange, one-sided conversation, but he felt a sense of connection, a strange companionship with the ghost of a lonely seamstress. He wasn't just a man who was haunted. He was a man who was no longer alone. But the companionship was not without its own brand of terror. Sometimes he would wake up, and the blankets would not be tucked. Instead, they would be pulled down to his feet, and he would feel a cold, icy presence on his chest. It was a new kind of tuck, a new kind of terror. It was a warning, a reminder that she was not just a kind old woman, she was a ghost. And ghosts are not always kind. One morning, he woke up, and he was not just tucked in. He was wrapped tightly in the blanket, his arms and legs bound to his body. He struggled to get free, his heart pounding with a primal, suffocating fear. He heard a soft whisper, a voice that was not in his ears, but in his mind. "Stay a while. I'm lonely." He finally managed to get free, his body shaking with terror. The blankets were perfectly wrapped, a tight, impossible cocoon. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, and he saw a man who was no longer just a tenant. He was a possession. Clara was not just a companion, she was a captor. He fled the apartment, ran out into the city streets, a man who had lost his mind. He found a friend, a man who had always been a skeptic, and he told him everything. The ghost, the tucking, the whispers. His friend listened, his face a mask of concern. He tried to be supportive, but the look in his eyes told a different story. He believed that his friend had gone crazy. Alex knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't go back to the apartment, to the woman who was trying to love him to death. He lived on the streets for a week, sleeping in parks and bus stations, a man with no home, no peace, no sanity. He was a fugitive from a ghost. One night, he was huddled in an alley, the cold Chicago wind biting at his skin. He felt a soft hand on his shoulder. He looked up, and he saw a woman. She was an old woman with a kind face and gentle eyes. She was holding a blanket. "You must be cold," she said, her voice soft and full of concern. She put the blanket around him, and gently, carefully, she tucked him in. He looked at her, and he saw a face that was both familiar and alien. It was the face of Clara. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman smiled, a kind, loving smile. She sat down next to him, and she began to talk. She told him about her life, about her home, about her love for her work. She talked, and he listened. A man who was no longer alone, he was with his ghost. She had followed him, she had found him, she had never let him go. The tucking was not just a gesture of care, it was a shackle, a promise that he would be hers forever. Why his bedroom window was always unlocked in the morning. The apartment on the third floor of a pre-war brownstone in Brooklyn was a classic New York City find. High ceilings, hardwood floors that groaned with every step, and large windows that looked out onto a quiet, tree-lined street. For Ethan, a young architect, it was a dream. He had moved there for the space and the light, a welcome change from the cramped studio he had occupied for years. He meticulously arranged his furniture, set up his drafting table by the window, and settled into a life of predictable, quiet solitude. The first strange occurrence was so subtle he almost missed it. He was a creature of habit, and his morning ritual never varied. He would wake up, get a cup of coffee, and then go to his bedroom window to look at the street below. One morning, as he opened the blinds, he noticed his window was unlocked. He distinctly remembered locking it the night before. He was a stickler for security, a habit ingrained from years of city living. He shook his head, thinking he must have been tired, and locked it again. It happened the next day, and the day after that. Every morning, without fail, the window would be unlocked. He started to take it more seriously. He would double-check the lock before getting into bed. He would even take a picture of it with his phone, the lock firmly in place, the brass bolt slid securely into the frame. In the morning, he would check the photo and then look at the window. The photo would show the window locked, the window would be unlocked. He couldn't explain it. He was a rational man, a man who believed in cause and effect. He considered every possibility. Was it a draft? A faulty lock? He took the lock apart, cleaned it, and reassembled it. It worked perfectly. He even installed a secondary lock, a simple latch, at the top of the window frame. He would lock both of them, and in the morning, both would be unlocked. It was a maddening, impossible reality. The feeling of dread began to seep into his life. He was no longer just annoyed, he was terrified. Someone or something was in his room every night. He couldn't shake the image of a gaunt, shadowy figure standing by his bed watching him sleep. He had no proof, no other evidence of an intrusion. The apartment was pristine in the morning. Nothing moved, nothing missing, just the open window. He bought a motion-activated camera, a small, discreet one that he placed on his dresser, pointing directly at the window. He was so nervous that night he barely slept, waking up at every creak of the floorboards. In the morning, he checked the camera. The video showed him getting into bed, the room falling silent. He fast-forwarded through the footage, watching himself sleeping peacefully. Then, at 2:47 a.m., he saw it. The camera's red light flickered on, the window was in the frame, and he saw, with a gut-wrenching certainty, the lock on the top latch slowly, silently slide out of place. A moment later, the main lock followed, the brass bolt retracting with an almost imperceptible click. The window itself did not move. It was as if an invisible hand had reached out and unlocked it. He watched, his heart pounding as the video continued. Nothing else happened. The room was still. The camera's light turned off and the video ended a few seconds later. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He had proof. There was a presence in his room, an entity that was not human that was unlocking his window every night. But why? What did it want? He looked at the video again, searching for any other sign, any other clue, but there was nothing. The room was a tableau of perfect silence and stillness. Just a window, unlocking itself. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. The feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable to an invisible intruder, was too much to bear. He called his landlord, told him he was breaking his lease, and began packing his belongings. He didn't tell his friends or family why. He didn't want to sound crazy. How could he explain that he was leaving his dream apartment because a ghost was unlocking his window? He found a new place, a modern high-rise in a different part of the city. The windows were new, made of reinforced glass, and the locks were mechanical marvels. He felt a sense of relief as he settled in, a feeling of security that he hadn't known in weeks. He meticulously checked every lock, every evening, before he went to bed. He was determined to leave the terror behind. The first week was peaceful. He slept soundly, his dreams free of shadows and fear. He started to believe it was over, that he had finally escaped whatever had haunted him. But then, one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible film of dust on his nightstand. He wiped it away, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, it was there again. And the morning after that, it was as if someone had run a single, ghostly finger over the surface of the wood. Then, he found something in his bed. A small, black feather. It was impossibly thin, almost like a piece of ash, and it was nestled in his sheets, right by his pillow. He picked it up, his hand trembling. It didn't look like any feather he had ever seen. It was a cold, alien object. He was losing his mind. He was trying to find a rational explanation for irrational events. He was back in the same cycle of fear, the same cycle of disbelief. He went to the old apartment. The window was locked, just as he had left it. He looked up at his old room, at the large, beautiful window, a window that had become a source of profound terror. He wondered if his replacement had noticed the unlocked window in the morning. He decided to do more research. He went to the local historical society, a musty old building filled with the memories of the city. He looked through old records of his brownstone, tracing its history back to the 1800s. He found a story, a small, almost forgotten article from a local newspaper. A young boy, a child named Edward, had lived in the building in the late 1800s. The boy was an insomniac, a child who would stay up all night, sketching in his notebook, his mind filled with fantastic, impossible creatures. The boy had an obsession with the window. He would open it every night, regardless of the weather, and stare out into the darkness, claiming he was watching for something that was coming for him. The article ended abruptly, mentioning that the boy had died in his sleep, a sudden, unexplained illness. The last person to see him had said that he had insisted on his window being left unlocked, a plea that his parents had ignored. Leo felt a cold dread so complete it was a physical weight. The boy's room. It was his old bedroom. The boy had been looking for something, a creature from his drawings, and he had believed that leaving the window unlocked was his only hope. He had died, and the window was locked. But what if the thing he was waiting for had finally come for him? And what if, in death, he was still waiting, still trying to open the window to let it in? He went home, his mind a feverish blur of fear and understanding. He looked at his modern, secure windows. He had left the old apartment, but the memory, the terror, the presence had followed him. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair, watching the sunrise, a cold, hard knot of fear in his stomach. The next morning, he went to his bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the window. It was closed. He looked at the lock. It was locked. He felt a profound sense of relief. But then he saw it. A single, small, black feather on the windowsill. The same cold, impossible feather he had found in his bed. It wasn't just his old apartment that was haunted. He was. The entity, the thing Edward had been waiting for, had found him. It wasn't coming in through the window. It was already in. He called a locksmith, a friend of his who specialized in antique locks. He had a strange request. He wanted him to install an old, complicated, beautiful lock on his modern window. He wanted a lock that would be a challenge, a lock that would require skill and care to open. His friend, curious, asked him why. Leo just said he had a fascination with old mechanisms. The lock was installed. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a brass lock with a complex series of tumblers and bolts. It was a statement, a challenge to the invisible intruder. He went to bed that night, a single black feather on his bedside table, a silent promise. He wasn't going to run anymore. He woke up with a start. The clock on his nightstand read 2:47 a.m. He looked at the window. It was still locked. He looked at his nightstand. The feather was gone. He felt a deep, profound sense of terror. It was no longer a game of unlocking windows. It was a game of possession. The entity was in his home, in his life, and it was moving his things, taunting him. The terror was no longer a silent presence. It was an active force. He spent the next few months living in a constant state of fear. He would come home to find objects moved, his keys on a different hook, his books in a different order. He would find these small black feathers in the most impossible places, in his coffee mug, in his shoe, in his pocket. The entity was toying with him, making him question his sanity. He would find notes on his computer, notes he didn't write, notes that said, "I'm here." He couldn't take it anymore. He had to confront it. He was a rational man, but he was at the end of his rope. He would do the impossible. He would leave his window unlocked. He would invite it in. He would face it. That night, he went to his bedroom window, his hands shaking, and he unlocked the intricate brass lock. He did the same to the old-fashioned latch on the top. He left the window open, just a crack, a silent invitation. He got into bed, a cold, hard lump of dread in his stomach. He didn't close his eyes. He waited. He waited for the cold, the shadow, the presence. He waited for the feather to appear. He waited for what felt like an eternity. Nothing happened. The sun began to rise, casting a pale glow into his room. He was exhausted, but he had no fear. He looked at his window. It was still unlocked. He looked at his nightstand. There were no feathers. He felt a profound sense of confusion. Had it all been a dream? Had he gone crazy? He got out of bed, a new question in his mind. Not why was his window unlocked, but why was it no longer unlocked? He walked over to the window, his mind racing. He looked out at the street below, at the people walking to work, at the world that was moving on without him. He looked at the window, and he saw a note. A small piece of paper, folded into a perfect square, was stuck to the glass. He opened the window and grabbed the note. It said, "It's too late. I'm already inside." He didn't run. He just stood there, the note in his hand, looking at his reflection in the glass. He saw a man who had lost his mind, a man who had invited a ghost into his home. He looked at his reflection, and he saw a single, small, black feather in his hair. He looked at the note in his hand, and he felt a single, slow knock on the back of his head. A knock that he knew was not the wind, not a neighbor, not the house settling. It was the last goodbye. It was the last time he would ever feel alone.
Halloween has always been about masks and costumes, about becoming someone or something else for just one night. But in the fall of 1989, in the quiet suburb of Ashford Heights, Connecticut, one man took that concept to a place so dark and twisted that it would forever change how that community celebrated the holiday. His name was Martin Dreyfuss, and while the world knew him as a friendly middle school science teacher who loved Halloween more than anyone else in town, behind the elaborate decorations and generous candy bowls was a collector of the most horrifying kind. This is the story of the man the FBI would later call the Halloween collector, and the night his carefully constructed world finally came crashing down. Martin Dreyfuss was 43 years old in 1989, a lifelong bachelor who had taught 8th grade science at Ashford Middle School for nearly 15 years. His students loved him. He was the teacher who made learning fun, who brought in real animal skulls and let the kids touch them, who could make even the most boring lesson about photosynthesis seem fascinating. But it was his love of Halloween that made him truly legendary in Ashford Heights. Every year without fail, Martin would transform his modest 2-story colonial home into the neighborhood's premier Halloween destination. We're talking about a month-long project that began the first week of October. He would erect an elaborate graveyard in his front yard, complete with fog machines and motion-activated tombstones. He built a tunnel of terror through his garage, where brave trick-or-treaters could walk through curtains of fake spider webs, while animatronic zombies lurched at them from the shadows. And his decorations weren't cheap store-bought plastic. Martin was an artist. He hand-sculpted his own props, creating incredibly lifelike corpses and monsters that were so realistic that parents would sometimes complain they were too scary for young children. But Martin would just laugh in that good-natured way of his and say that Halloween was supposed to be scary. On Halloween night, he would dress in an elaborate costume, something different every year. One year, he was a plague doctor with an authentic-looking leather mask. Another year, he was a convincing werewolf with professional-grade prosthetics. He would stand on his porch from 5 in the evening until well past 10 at night, personally greeting every single trick-or-treater, acting out his character, and handing out full-sized candy bars. The kids would line up down the block just to visit Mr. Dreyfuss's house. Parents considered it a rite of passage. But what none of them knew, what no one could have possibly known, was that Martin's obsession with Halloween, with masks and costumes and transformation, had a much darker purpose. He wasn't just celebrating the holiday. He was hunting. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came on the morning of November 1st, 1989. A 13-year-old girl named Rebecca Hartley had gone trick-or-treating the night before with a group of her friends. They had visited dozens of houses, including Mr. Dreyfuss's elaborate haunted setup. Rebecca had come home around 9:30 that night, showed her parents her haul of candy, and gone to bed. But when her mother went to wake her for school the next morning, Rebecca's bed was empty. The window to her second-floor bedroom was open, and the screen had been carefully removed from the outside and placed on the floor. Rebecca was gone. The Ashford Heights police launched an immediate investigation. They quickly discovered something that made their blood run cold. Rebecca wasn't the first. When they started digging through old missing persons reports from surrounding towns, they found a pattern. Over the past 7 years, 6 children had vanished on Halloween night or in the early morning hours of November 1st. All of them were between the ages of 12 and 14. All of them had been trick-or-treating in their respective neighborhoods. And in every single case, they had disappeared from their bedrooms through a second-story window that had been opened from the outside. The realization was horrifying. Someone had been using Halloween as cover, watching children as they trick-or-treated, following them home, and then returning in the dead of night to take them. A serial kidnapper had been operating across Connecticut for 7 years, and no one had connected the dots until now. The FBI was called in immediately. Special Agent Sarah Chen led the task force. She was a specialist in child abduction cases, and she knew they were in a race against time. Statistically, if Rebecca was still alive, they had maybe 72 hours to find her before her chances of survival dropped to almost zero. The investigation was massive and frantic. Every registered sex offender in a 50-mile radius was brought in for questioning. They set up roadblocks and searched vehicles. They brought in bloodhounds and searched the woods surrounding Ashford Heights. But they found nothing. Rebecca had simply vanished. It was Rebecca's best friend, a girl named Jennifer, who provided the first real lead. She told investigators that when their group had visited Mr. Dreyfus's house, he had been dressed as the Grim Reaper, complete with a black hooded robe and a realistic skull mask. He had been handing out candy and acting scary as usual. But Jennifer mentioned something odd. She said that Mr. Dreyfus had seemed particularly interested in Rebecca. He had complimented her costume, which was a simple vampire outfit, and had asked her several questions about where she lived and whether she lived on a first or second floor. At the time, Jennifer thought he was just being nice and making conversation. But now, in the context of Rebecca's disappearance, it felt sinister. Agent Chen decided to pay Martin Dreyfus a visit. It was just a routine interview, she told herself. After all, he was a respected teacher with no criminal record. He had lived in Ashford Heights for over 20 years. There was no reason to suspect him. But Chen was a careful investigator, and she knew that sometimes the monster is hiding in plain sight. When she and two local detectives arrived at Martin's house on the afternoon of November 2nd, they found him in his front yard taking down his Halloween decorations. He was friendly, cooperative, and seemed genuinely shocked and saddened to hear about Rebecca's disappearance. He invited them inside for coffee. The inside of Martin's home was neat and tastefully decorated. There were bookshelves filled with science textbooks and classic literature. His walls were covered with framed photos of his students over the years, all smiling at science fairs and field trips. He seemed like a devoted teacher. When asked about Halloween night, Martin had a detailed recollection. He remembered Rebecca's group visiting. He confirmed that he had chatted with her briefly about her costume. But he insisted he had spoken to probably 200 kids that night, and Rebecca hadn't stood out in any particular way. He provided his whereabouts for the entire night. He had been on his porch until 10:15, then had spent about an hour cleaning up, and had gone to bed around midnight. He lived alone, so he had no alibi for the overnight hours, but neither did most single people. Agent Chen thanked him for his time, and the investigators left. But something was bothering her. It was nothing concrete, just a feeling. As they walked back to their car, she looked back at Martin's house and noticed something. The basement had small windows at ground level, but they had been painted black from the inside. It was unusual, but not unheard of. Lots of people finished their basements as media rooms and painted the windows for darkness. Still, the image stuck in her mind. That evening, Chen decided to dig deeper into Martin Dreyfus's background. What she found was a life that was almost too normal, too carefully constructed. He had no family. Both his parents were dead, and he had been an only child. He had never been married, never even seemed to have dated. His entire life revolved around his job and Halloween. She pulled his employment records and found that he had taken personal days from school during the first week of November for the past 7 years. And when she cross-referenced those dates with the missing children, she felt her heart start to race. Every single time a child had vanished on Halloween, Martin Dreyfus had taken the next 3 to 5 days off from work. Chen knew she didn't have enough for a warrant. Circumstantial evidence and a bad feeling wouldn't convince a judge. But she couldn't shake the certainty that was growing in her gut. She decided to put Martin under 24-hour surveillance. If he was their guy, and if Rebecca was still alive, he might lead them to her. For the next 18 hours, nothing happened. Martin went to school, taught his classes, came home, graded papers. He seemed completely normal. But then, at 2:30 in the morning on November 3rd, The surveillance team watching Martin's house radioed in. Martin had just left his house carrying a large black duffel bag. He got into his car and started driving. Chen and her team followed at a distance. Martin drove for nearly 40 minutes, heading away from the suburbs and into a rural area of thick woods and abandoned farms. He finally pulled off onto an old logging road and drove about a mile into the forest. The FBI team, now including a full tactical unit, followed on foot. What they found, hidden deep in the woods, was a small, dilapidated hunting cabin that had been abandoned for years. Martin had parked his car and was walking toward the cabin with his duffel bag. Chen gave the order, and the tactical team moved in. They breached the cabin door just as Martin was descending a set of wooden stairs into a hidden basement. The scene that greeted the investigators in that basement was the stuff of nightmares. It was a small underground room, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with stone walls that had been reinforced with soundproofing material. And there, chained to a metal bed frame, weak and terrified but alive, was Rebecca Hartley. Martin had been in the process of preparing what he called his procedure. Laid out on a metal table next to Rebecca were surgical instruments, makeup supplies, and most horrifyingly, several handcrafted masks made of a flexible material that looked disturbingly lifelike. During his interrogation, Martin Dreyfus confessed to everything with an eerie calmness that chilled even the experienced FBI agents. He explained that he had been obsessed with transformation and identity since childhood. He had been a lonely, bullied kid who found escape in wearing masks and becoming someone else. But as he grew older, his obsession had twisted into something monstrous. He didn't want to just wear a mask himself. He wanted to create living dolls, children, who he could transform into whatever character he wanted them to be. His plan, which he had been perfecting over 7 years, was to keep the children in his hidden cabin for approximately 1 week. During that time, he would create custom masks of their faces and force them to perform in elaborate scenarios he had written. He claimed he never physically harmed them and that after a week, he would release them miles away from where he had taken them. But as the investigation continued, the truth was far worse. The FBI found 6 graves in the woods surrounding the cabin. Martin had not released his victims. He had killed them after his week-long rituals, unable to let them go with the knowledge of what he had done. Rebecca Hartley had been hours away from becoming his 7th victim. Martin Dreyfus was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping. He is currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ashford Heights, like many towns touched by such horror, would never be quite the same. For years afterward, Halloween was a muted affair. Parents kept their children close, and many homes simply stopped participating in trick-or-treating altogether. But slowly, as the years passed and new families moved to the neighborhood, the joy of Halloween began to return. Yet every year, on October 31st, there is still one house on Maple Street that remains completely dark, its lawn empty of decorations, a reminder that monsters are real and that sometimes they are hiding behind the kindest smiles and the most generous candy bowls.